It was just another quiet Tuesday morning. I, Nathaniel Brooks, police chief of Silver Pine, found myself enjoying a rare moment of calm. The sun was just beginning to rise over our peaceful suburban neighborhood, painting the houses in soft shades of amber and gold. I had just poured myself a cup of freshly brewed coffee and stepped out onto my front porch, breathing in the crisp, clean air that only mornings like this seemed to offer. The street was coming to life slowly, like an orchestra warming up before the grand performance of the day. Families hurriedly gathered backpacks and lunchboxes. Joggers passed by nodding politely, and birds chirped their morning melodies from tree branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was an idyllic scene, a patchwork of warmth and routine. And for a moment, I allowed myself to appreciate it. Mondays were usually brutal. Paperwork, meetings on community safety, and internal reviews that drained the energy right out of me. But Tuesdays had the potential to be something else entirely. I took a slow sip from my mug and let my gaze wander down to the mailbox at the edge of my driveway. Half expecting the usual stack of bills and junk mail, I figured I might as well check it before heading back inside. With an easy pace, I walked toward the mailbox. When I opened it, my hand found something thin and familiar, a white envelope. My pulse quickened slightly when I saw the letterhead through the thin paper. This was my paycheck. Weeks of overtime shifts and late-night patrols condensed into this slip of paper. I held it for a second longer than necessary, feeling a small but satisfying sense of accomplishment. It wasn't about the money. It was about what it represented: hard work, dedication, and service. Just as I was about to turn back toward the house, movement caught the corner of my eye. I saw someone approaching, crossing over the carefully trimmed lawn like they belonged there. It was Evelyn Grant, my neighbor. Evelyn had lived 2 houses down for years. Our relationship had always been polite, distant, and frankly strained. She was one of those people who seemed to thrive on stirring up conflict over the smallest of issues. Some folks around here referred to her as that woman, a nicer substitute for what they really wanted to call her. She was known for her complaints, for her petitions about lawn lengths, and her accusations about neighborhood kids riding bikes too fast. But this morning, something about her was different. Her eyes were laser-focused on me, or rather on the envelope in my hand. There was a single-mindedness in her stride that made my stomach knot up. I frowned. Why was she coming over now? And why did it look like she was headed straight for me without so much as a greeting? Before I could make sense of it, Evelyn's hand shot out with surprising speed. She snatched the paycheck right out of my grip. For a moment, I stood frozen. My brain scrambled to process what I had just seen. Evelyn Grant, my neighbor, a woman who had waved to me only yesterday, had just stolen my paycheck. Right there, in broad daylight. The flush of disbelief was quickly overtaken by a surge of anger. I took a deep breath, gripping my coffee cup tightly as I stepped down from the porch. "Evelyn," I called out, forcing my voice to remain level despite the storm churning in my chest. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" She turned slowly, her eyes wide for a fraction of a second. But the look of alarm was quickly replaced by something else entirely, a smug, defiant smirk that made my blood boil. "You don't deserve this," she said casually, waving the check in the air like a prize. "People like you get paid way too much for doing next to nothing." Her words stung deeper than I cared to admit. I had dealt with difficult people before, plenty of them. But Evelyn's words cut through the air like a knife coated in venom. I wasn't just dealing with a thief. I was dealing with prejudice, raw and unapologetic. "Put it down," I said, my voice like steel, even though a fire raged within me. "Right now. That's theft, Evelyn, and I will report you." Instead of backing off, she laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed too loudly in the morning quiet. "What are you going to do?" she taunted. "Call your cop buddies? What's that going to prove?" I held her gaze, grounding myself in the principles that had carried me through years of public service. I wasn't going to let her turn this into something it wasn't. I wasn't going to let her define me. "You're stealing from a police chief," I reminded her, holding my badge up so she could see it catch the light. "You know exactly what that means." Her eyes narrowed. "You're just another black man in a uniform," she said, her voice heavy with disdain. That badge doesn't scare me. Her words hit like a hammer. They left bruises I knew would last, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't. Not here. Not now. I crossed my arms, staring her down with a calm I had to summon from deep within. Listen carefully, Evelyn, I said quietly. You need to think long and hard about what you're doing right now. You don't want this to escalate. For a moment, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. A hesitation. But then she pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed. She lifted the phone to her ear and shouted, "I'm calling the police. You're threatening me, Nathaniel." I let out a slow, measured breath. Was this really happening? I couldn't believe it. She was calling for backup, trying to paint herself as the victim. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Go ahead, I told her, my tone dry. I'm sure they'll see it my way. She fumed, her face flushing red as she babbled into the receiver. Meanwhile, I pulled out my own phone and texted my partner, Officer Darren Malik, who was patrolling nearby. Evelyn Grant just stole my paycheck. She's calling in a bogus report. Can you swing by? Darren responded instantly. Be there in 2. As I stood there, the weight of my badge pressing against my chest, I realized this wasn't just about a paycheck anymore. It was about what that paycheck represented. Years of service in a community where people like Evelyn still existed, where racism wasn't always as blatant as this, but was always there. I was tired, not just from this morning, but from years of being judged by my skin before my actions. Minutes later, I heard the wail of sirens in the distance. Relief flooded through me. Darren was here. His cruiser pulled up smoothly, and Darren stepped out with his usual unflappable calm. He was a big man, taller than me, with an imposing presence softened only by the kind eyes beneath his cap. We'd worked together for over a decade. If anyone understood the weight of this moment, it was him. Nate, he greeted me with a nod. Then he turned toward Evelyn, who was still clutching her phone. What's going on here? Darren asked, his voice firm but patient. Before I could respond, Evelyn cut in. He's threatening me. He's harassing me just because I was checking my mail. I clenched my jaw. That's not true, I said, motioning toward her. I caught her stealing my paycheck out of my mailbox. I have proof. Darren's expression didn't change. He looked at Evelyn, his gaze steady. Ma'am, he said, I'm going to need you to show me your hands. For a second, Evelyn froze. Her confidence cracked. You can't be serious, she spat. You're taking his word over mine? I'll be the judge of that, Darren replied. The moment felt suspended in time as he stepped toward her. Empty your pockets. Her lips trembled as she pulled out the envelope, holding it out with reluctant fingers. My name and address were printed clear as day on the front. Darren took the envelope, inspected it, and nodded grimly. That's enough, he said. Ma'am, you're under arrest for theft. Evelyn exploded. This is ridiculous. You can't do this to me. But we could, because the law applied to everyone. And in that moment, standing beside Darren, I was reminded why we did what we did. As Darren cuffed her and placed her in the back of the cruiser, he glanced at me. You okay? I nodded. Thanks for having my back. Always, he said. This isn't just about a paycheck. No, I agreed. It's about the bigger fight. I watched as the squad car drove away, Evelyn's face pale through the rear window. The weight of the morning settled over me, not as a burden, but as a call to continue standing for what was right. This was just another Tuesday, but it would never be just another morning again.